Are you guys ready for part 2 of efficient workflow for bodice fitting? I hope you are. I'm excited. Last week I shared my version of what I think is the best place to start when you're fitting a bodice or top pattern. And I basically segmented the pattern pieces into the blue zone and the pink zone. The blue zone is shoulders, neck, and upper back. And pink zone is everything below that. I started up here at the top of the pattern pieces because that's where a shirt or bodice hangs from your body, and that really needs to be correct before you start fitting things below that. You'll notice I didn't mention things like position of bust dart or depth of armhole because those things change based on what you do up at the shoulders. So that's going to be next week's episode, how to adjust your depth of your armhole, how to check for your bust position, if you need a full bust adjustment, if you need a small bust adjustment, where your waist, where your hip is. That's where we'll be going next week. Before we go there, I want to show you how I prepared a mini pattern based on the instructions I gave last week. And I'm going to show you those pieces. I'm going to show you my little half muslin here on my little half scale dress form I have. Then I'm going to give you some ways that you can transfer the adjustments you make from your half muslin to your paper pattern. And then that's going to put you in a really good place to start working on the pink zone next week. So you can see in front of me here, these are my pattern pieces that I prepped. And I didn't mention it in part 1, but in addition to adding a safety seam allowance up at the shoulder to adjust the slope of the shoulder, I always think it's a good idea to add extra seam allowance to the side seams as well, because then you can let them out if you need to. Now, we may not do too much with that until we get into the pink zone, but it's good to have that there. And I'll show you one minor adjustment I did when I tested the fit of this pattern on my half scale dress form here. So this is what the pattern looks like. And what I want to do now is show you how I sewed it together. So you can see here, I sewed the darts, back dart, bust dart, and waist dart, and then I sewed the side seam and the shoulder seam so those seam allowance are face out. This is really helpful when you're trying it on because then you can just let it out and repin it to fit you. And everything on this half muslin is basted. I used the largest length stitch that I had on my machine, a 5.0, so things are easy to take out and, put back together if things need to be adjusted. So on the shoulder, you're looking to see that the shoulder seam is laying square in the middle of the top of your shoulder and that it ends at the tip of your shoulder here, and it's also, at the neck. You want to make sure that's nice and straight. And then you're looking to see if your side seam is straight as well. Let me change my view so you can see that a little bit better. All right, so you can see that the shoulder seam is square on my shoulder. Now, what would I do if I had to adjust it? I would basically take out my basting, and I can tell you that using these Kai seam removers make it so easy. Look at, I can just go whoop. And then let's say I needed to do some fitting here. I could extend this and shorten this if I needed to. So let's say I had a forward ball of the shoulder, for example. Let's say it was over here. So I would have to repin and stitch it like this. So you can see that having these extra safety seam allowances at the shoulder can allow us to make any sort of change we need. So you can see now the seam allowances are uneven because I let out the back and I took in the front. Okay, so that's one thing that you might need to do to fit your shoulder. Another thing would be if the slope of the shoulder needed to be adjusted, you could take in this seam deeper. Now, I don't need to do this on this particular muslin, but if you need to pinch both deeper, you could do that as well. So that's how you use the extra safety seam allowance to fit the shoulder. You can rotate it back, you can rotate it forward. You can also change what's happening at the neck side if you need to. So that's why it's nice to have this just basted, and then you can reposition it and rebaste it and try it on to make sure you have your final answer. Okay, and then the side seam, you want to make sure your side seam is running straight up and down on your body. So if it's not, you can let out or take in the side seam to get it straight. In this particular example, I did let it out about 1/4 of an inch to give myself wearing ease here, because I draped this on this to get these small pattern pieces, so it was skin tight when I draped it. So I let it out 1/4 of an inch just to give myself a little bit of wearable ease here. And you want to check and make sure the neck is hitting right in the front. Now, obviously, if you have an open neckline, just notice where it is on your body. Okay, this is a good opportunity to change the shape or depth of your neckline. So let's say you're working with a scoop neckline and it's too low. This would be a good time to make a note on how much you'd want to raise it or lower it. In the back, if you did a high round back adjustment, you want to make sure that the base of the neck is raised up to where it should be. Now, since we made this adjustment before we cut out our first muslin, it may need to be fine-tuned. So you can actually do a bigger adjustment if you need to raise it up a little higher, or you could remove some of the spread that you did to bring it back down if you added too much. So I'm going to put a link to part 1 of this series in the description below so you can review how to make all of these adjustments that I'm talking about in this video. I'm not going to show you how to do them again, but basically, if you did high round, check to make sure the back neckline is sitting at your back neck or where it should be based on what the flat drawings are telling you. And also make sure that it's not bumping up or picking up at center back. Okay, that's your indication that you have enough length because of the high round back curve here. So that's what you're going to look for in the back. You also want to just make sure, the width of the back is good. And you can see here, look at my armhole. My armhole is falling off the bodice. So really, I'm just going to make a note here with this pen, and I'm just going to bring this back onto the actual, back onto the bodice. So if you feel like your, the width didn't work out to be perfectly correct, you can make a note of how much you need to bring that in. So I did that right there. And then in the front, I can see that that is pretty good. I feel like that is the tip of the shoulder. And I feel like my front armhole is okay because it's where that should be. So the only adjustment I'm going to need to do to the armhole is in the back. It's sitting too, it's hanging off the back. So we need to do a narrow back adjustment here to pull that in. So I'm going to show you that. So look to make sure the fit across the back is good. Make sure the high round back adjustment did its work if you needed to do that. In the front, make sure your neckline is good. Make sure the slope of your shoulder is good. And that's really all we're going to worry about until we get into the pink zone. I put some instructions in part 1 PDF handout to adjust your sleeve a like amount. But I'm going to suggest now that maybe let's wait and adjust the sleeve until we completely finish the fitting of the bodice, because notice if I had made the changes based on what I did so far, I would still have to change it more because now I realize that my armhole is not 100% correct. So this is why I'm working with a half muslin for my very first bodice fitting, because I just want to iron out these last few things up at the top. And you can see I am going into the pink zone here because now I can see that the width across my upper back and lower is a little bit too wide. That's okay. We're going to fix that. I'm going to show you how to transfer adjustments to your paper pattern now. And then next week, I'm going to show you how to identify whether or not you need to change the depth of your armhole, how to tell if your bust dart is not in the right spot, and then we'll deal with waist and hip position as well. So that's what we'll be doing next week. So I'm going to just slide my girl out of the way. Now let me show you how to make these changes to your paper pattern. Let's start with slope of shoulder. I got a bunch of questions from part 1 asking about if we take up the slope of the shoulder, does it make the armhole too small, and do we need to scoop the bottom of the armhole? So what I recommend doing is, while you have your half bodice on, check and see if you pinned up the slope of the shoulder, lifting it up, shortening the length of the armhole. Check to see if the armhole feels tight. If it doesn't feel tight and you feel like you have enough ease in your armhole, you're just going to adjust the shoulder and then reduce the cap height. But if you pull the shoulder up and now your armhole feels snug, I'm going to show you a way to make this adjustment without changing the length of the armhole. Okay, so here you can see I've got my pattern right here, and I've marked my seam allowances and my extra allowances here. Let's say our final answer is along this line that I already drew. Okay, so we lower the slope of the shoulder, and what we're going to do is we're going to measure the amount that we lowered, and that would be about 3/8 of an inch. Let's say that we did that equally front and back. That means we have to shorten the shoulder 3/8 of an inch front and back. So again, check to see how the armhole is feeling. If it's too loose, you can just chop it off here and move on. And then also take 3/4 of an inch of height out of your entire sleeve cap. But let's say if you pull it up and it's too tight, I'm going to show you a different thing to do. So the first thing you're going to do is, if this is your stitching line, and let me use a different color Sharpie so it's easy to see. So this was our final stitching line. Okay, I am now going to mark my 1/2 inch seam allowance because we fit it. So the first thing I'm going to do is, you can probably guess what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut off this extra that I don't need. So I'm getting rid of the extra allowance at the shoulder. We only needed that for adjusting the slope. All right, so there's our new shoulder seam. All right, so that's what you would do if you are just making the adjustment and cutting off the extra from the shoulder, if your armhole has the extra ease that you can do that. Now I'm going to show you on the back what to do if you don't have extra and you need to keep the armhole the original measurement. So the first thing I'm going to do here is, let me just mark my new shoulder right here. Okay, so there's the new slope of my shoulder right there. So I'm just going to measure. Okay, so we know that's 3/8 of an inch. That was my stitching line. But instead of cutting anything off, I'm just going to get rid of the extra safety seam allowance now because we don't need that anymore. And I'm going to draw a box around my armhole from the center of the shoulder to just under the armhole, like this. Now this adjustment, you can only use this adjustment if you made a like adjustment front and back, meaning you picked up both the front and back shoulder the same amount to make a more sloped shoulder. Because what we're going to do is we're going to mark down here that 3/8 of an inch that we lowered the slope. Okay, so this amount right here is what we lowered over here. So we're going to take the stitching out. What we're going to do is we're going to cut this out and slide it down. Okay, and you'll see what's going to happen is we're going to create the slope we needed. So I'm just sliding that down. And then we'll be able to use the original seam allowance to sew. So we'll be able to use this original, 1/2 inch seam allowance, whatever it was. I'm going to need to put a little bit of paper here. Let me just put this little paper here. And then what you're going to do is you're going to connect. Oh, let me just get rid of this because it's confusing. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to connect the original shoulder seam with the new lower slope of the shoulder, because you can see we lowered it the 3/8 of an inch by sliding it down. So basically now the new outside edge, or the cut edge of our shoulder, is going to be here. Okay, and you can see what we've done is we've created that slope that we needed without changing the length of the armhole. We just slid it down. But what else did we do? We shortened the shoulder seam. So you have to make sure you make a like adjustment front and back so your side seams still match. So that's an adjustment you can do if you ended up doing slope of shoulder. Now, if you changed the shoulder because you had a forward ball of the shoulder, chances are you'll just be able to just trim off the front and add to the back wherever your seam is, because one's giving and one's taking away, and you're not changing the length of the armhole that much. You may need to reposition the notch of the shoulder, and you may need to lengthen the back armhole a little bit and shorten the front armhole a little bit, but it's not as invasive as, really taking up that tip of the shoulder if you have a very sloped shoulder. So this is a strategy you can use if your armhole is fitting well and you can't take it up by just trimming it off the top. Now, the other thing I want to show you here is, remember, we checked the width of our pattern here. So we checked this and we noticed that it was a little bit too wide. So what you want to do is you want to get your muslin, and I'm just going to take it off my little half scale form here. And you want to look and see where you marked. Okay, so basically the easiest way to make this adjustment, especially if you're working with a muslin, is to use the in the seam allowance method. Let me show you how to just bring that back in a little bit if your upper back turned out to be too wide. Now, you could use this adjustment in reverse if you need to let it out as well. And also this adjustment works if the chest was too narrow or too wide. So I'm going to create pivots all along my armhole edge. So I'm going to put a pivot here. 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 I'm going to cut my armhole stitching line like this. And I've got all these pivots. So basically, I'm just going to clip all these pivots like this. And what that's going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to push this in the amount that I needed. And if I want to make myself a little guide based on what my muslin did, okay, I took it off my half scale dress form to show you. So let's say we just need to make that little 1/4 inch. I'm just going to sort of draw it in to give me a guideline. And then I'm just going to very gently, I'm going to use my fancy new stiletto. So see, I can use my stiletto, and as I work, let's make this pivot here, I can tape my armhole over like this. And basically you can see I'm just pushing it in to remove the amount I needed to move. Now this is a little bit, what do I want to say? Pesky, because I'm working with a little half scale pattern. On a full scale pattern, this really would work out okay. So you can see here, I'm going to just tape it into position like this. I'm going to tape this one here, and then I'm just going to tape this one. My little seam allowance broke, but basically you can see what's happening is I'm just taping this into position to get rid of that extra width. Okay, and we do have a little gap over here, but I'm not going to worry about that right now, but you can see I've pulled that in the amount that it was hanging off of my half scale dress form. All right, so those are the things you can do to fine tune the fit of your half fit muslin. You can check, double check the slope of the shoulder, double check the length of the shoulder, double check the width of the chest and upper back. Make sure your high round back is positioned right. And if it's not, you can either make more of an adjustment or you can take some of the adjustment back by reslashing and overlapping the amount you need to reduce your adjustment. Those are the things you want to do to get ready to dive into the pink zone next week. So again, I would leave your sleeve alone until you have finished fitting the front and back bodice, and we'll get to that next. I would keep very careful notes on what you change. So for example, on here, I'm going to say reduce back, upper back with, 1/4 inch. And I'm going to say lowered slope 3/8. Okay, make those notes on your pattern pieces so you know what you did. Lower slope 3/8 inch. Okay, and then when you get done and you're ready to work on your sleeve, you'll have some notes to refer to. So if you have any questions or comments about part 2 of efficient workflow for fitting bodices or tops, please post those below and I will help you. Next week, we're going to go into the pink zone, and I will include all of this information that I'm sharing with you today in the next PDF companion, so you'll have it, to refer to in a paper version as well. So I hope you're enjoying this series. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Please join me on Friday for FabFit Friday. I am really progressing on my cleaning of my studio. I'm so excited to show you some of the new ideas I have for reorganizing, and yeah, I'm very excited. Thank you for following along with me on that as well. So have a great day, and thanks for watching.